We have a special pod for you today. Katie Couric recently sat down with me at the Paley Center for Media in New York City. We discussed how cancer has touched many of her family members, including a recent diagnosis of her own. We also discussed her role as Screen Queen, promoting cancer screenings for all, and how the media can make a positive impact on public health. Let's talk about it. Hello, I'm Dr. Diane Reidy-Lagunes from Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, and welcome to Cancer Straight Talk. We're bringing together national experts and patients fighting these diseases to have evidence-based conversations. Our mission is to empower you and your family members to make the right decisions and live happier, healthier lives. For more information on the topics discussed here or to send us your questions, please visit us at mskcc.org/podcast.
What an honor to be joined here today with Katie Couric at the Paley Center for Media in New York City. Award-winning journalist, author, trailblazer, and all-around American icon. And I, the cancer doc, are going to try to interview you. Lordy.
You're going to be great.
Here we go.
I know it. Don't worry. And this is fun being at the Paley Center. I think this is one of the first podcasts in their soundproof booth. And we have an audience outside, which is so nice. Everyone came to listen to us. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting me on the show.
Thank you. It's such a tremendous honor, and you've really been such an advocate for cancer screenings and for the importance of early cancer detection. Your voice and promotion has literally translated into saving thousands of lives. And I think it all started with that little pretty colon that was seen around the world. The number of colonoscopies that shot up 20% nationwide after that, and your role in inspiring others to get cancer screenings in the medical community and beyond is known as the Couric Effect. And you did not stop there. Your mission and role as Screen Queen continued over the years. You shared your his and hers colonoscopies with your husband, John, who is with us today. And just this past year, while documenting your mammogram, you revealed your personal story of breast cancer. So, Katie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's an honor. And I mean, I should be interviewing you because you're so impressive, Diane, with all the work you're doing, and you're saving lives every day. So it's an honor to be here with you as well.
Well, it certainly takes a village. And I am a GI cancer doc, and I care for patients with neuroendocrine cancers as well as colon cancers. We'll talk about that a little bit later. For those who may not have yet read your amazing, brutally honest book, Going There, can you share with us your personal connection with colon cancer in particular and how that started?
Of course. You know, I was really lucky until I turned 40. You know, I had sort of this picture-perfect life. No one in my family had ever really been sick. And, really happy childhood. My parents lived for a long time, 91 and 90. And so that was much later. But up until the age of 40, everything was great. And then when I was 40 and my husband was 41, Jay Monahan, was diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic colon cancer. It kind of came out of the blue. In retrospect, less out of the blue than I originally thought. But it was a shock, and it was incredibly traumatic, as you might imagine. Our daughters at the time of his diagnosis were 1 and 5, and when he died, they were 2 and 6. So he battled the disease for 9 months, and it was as harrowing as you could imagine. So that was my first experience, really, with someone very close to me being diagnosed with this disease. And I became an expert of sorts because I put on my reporter's hat and tried to learn everything I could about the disease.
And we see that often. The caregivers feel this responsibility, but you certainly took that much further. I would like to go back to that day more than 20 years ago when you decided to broadcast your first colonoscopy on the Today Show. Did you have any understanding of the impact that made? I mean, you literally that day rebranded colonoscopies and you just demystified it in a way. People never talked about colons or the idea of endoscopies. And yet You clearly made an impact that even today, it's just there's less of a stigma associated. Did you know it at the time that it was going to be so powerful?
I didn't know what impact it would have, but I knew that it was something I felt compelled and really responsible to do. We had millions of people watching every morning. I think a lot of people followed what had happened to Jay, and it was covered in the press, and we kept as quiet as we could about his situation, but people knew when he died. It was announced on the show, and it had been such a difficult 9 months for me and for Jay's family and for my family, and obviously for Jay. I felt that I needed to educate people so they could know that with early detection, there's an over 90% cure rate. I became almost encyclopedic with my knowledge of colon cancer and colonoscopies. Obviously, he was too young to
That's
be
right.
screened and to get a colonoscopy. But I think had I known everything then that I know now, I would have been much more aware of the symptoms. I think I would have urged him to talk to his doctor about colon cancer screening. But like so many young men, Jay didn't even have an internist. He came to my internist when he was doubled over in pain, and our nanny called right after the Today Show ended and said, "You need to come home. Jay is really in excruciating pain." So I just felt I wanted to spare other families from what we had endured. And I thought this is probably something that needed to be done. I remember when President Reagan had polyps, and that was, I think, the first public figure that talked openly about colons and colon cancer. So I guess we owe a bit of thanks to President Reagan for being transparent about it, and for the White House, I guess, talking about these things. But I think that we have this phobia about talking about this part of our bodies. And, I was reading The Emperor of All Maladies by Sid Mukherjee, which won a Pulitzer Prize, but it's sort of the history of cancer. And I thought it was so interesting that in the 1950s, when they were looking for a support group for women with breast cancer, in the New York Times, they couldn't say breast cancer, they said cancer of the chest cavity. And I thought, we just have to remove these stigmas. And I think people weren't comfortable talking about colons and talking about poop and talking about all the things that we do to have healthy bodies. And I remember reading a book to my girls when they were little called Everybody Poops.
That's right.
I feel like that should be required reading for adults now too, because we need to normalize these conversations, and having a healthy colon and preventing colon cancer is just a critical part of maintaining your overall health. So to answer your question, Diane, which was very long-winded for me, is I was delighted that people paid attention, that even my stupid conversation, which I can't believe I was so awake during my
Yeah.
colonoscopy, but I remember telling Ken Ford, who performed it, really wonderful doctor who died not too long ago, happened to be a Black doctor. And I remember a colleague saying, "Thank you so much for having a Black doctor perform your colonoscopy." And I said, "Gosh, I didn't really think of that." But that was a very important aspect of my getting screened on national television as well. But anyway, the fact that people listened and paid attention and went and got screened was incredibly gratifying. And I got so many letters, people thanking me that people found polyps, or they found cancerous polyps, or the cancer was detected early enough that they had chemotherapy, but that they were doing well. I had people sending me pictures of their colons, and I was like, "Thanks for
Thank you. I know,
sharing."
thanks.
And sometimes they would go into a lot of detail,
Oh,
and I'd
boy.
be like, "TMI, thanks. I'm
you.
glad you got
Yeah.
screened." But yes, of course. I mean, the idea that you delivered information that helped save someone's life, that prompted them to take action. and that action saved their lives. I mean, of course, what better feeling is there than that?
So for those that are listening, anyone 45 and older, we very much should get those colonoscopies. Like you said, look for those polyps, you take them out, and then you can prevent the cancer from happening.
That's right. And it's important that you note that the age has been reduced to
That's right.
45 for Black Americans. It has been 45 for some time, but because of the alarming incidence of colorectal cancer in younger patients, the reason I would love to ask you a question about
Yeah.
that, Dr. Reidy. Maybe you'll give me a chance to do that. But the age has been lowered. And, I am working with Exact Sciences because, you can also do stool tests. And I think colonoscopy is still considered the quote unquote gold standard. But even gastroenterologists I spoke with, because I obviously want to be able to endorse only tests that are good and accurate. There are some people who won't get a colonoscopy who, for various reasons, they have no insurance, they don't have access, they can't miss work, they have daycare concerns. And so any test is really better than no test at
That's
all,
absolutely
whatever
right.
test
You're
gets
right.
done. And so I really urge people to talk to their doctors to get a screening that's right for them, because still 1 in 3 people are not screened for
That's right.
colorectal cancer. And that means a lot of people will die unnecessarily. And when you think about colon cancer being the number 2 cancer killer of men and women combined, that is a lot of people. I think
51,000. Yeah, that's
51
right.
or 52,000 people die every year. And that's the same number about who died in the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
So I think we need to really spread the word and keep talking about it, because that's one of those things that people just soon forget about.
That's
I mean,
right.
nobody really,
That's
for
right.
a whole host of reasons, wants to necessarily get screened for a lot of different
Of course.
cancers.
Yeah.
But it's so important. And I always think, I don't want people to say, if only I had gotten screened. And I always also do the guilt trip on people. I'm like, it's really selfish not to get screened.
Yeah. For you and
Because
your
if
loved
you
ones,
want to
yeah.
be around for the people you love and the people who love and depend on you, you owe it to them to get screened. If all else fails, I do the guilt trip.
Good.
Yeah.
As you should. Many people may not have known in the years following Jay's death, you and this famous air colonoscopy, cancer did strike again in your family. Can you share any advice to some of the family members, particularly as a caregiver, or some things that you've learned in retrospect over the years? Because, between your sister, your mother-in-law, and now your second husband had also had some cancer. So any words of advice? Because I will say that actually many of my patients have said that your example to push forward, particularly after reading your book, has really been the whisper in their ear that it's possible to move forward. And, by example, you've taught us all how to overcome things that feel like they're the unthinkable.
Well, I think before we even talk about moving forward, I think there are so many unanswered questions about how you help someone who has cancer. And I think this needs to be a bigger national dialogue, because I think people are so afraid of death. They're so afraid of terminal illness. I don't think anyone really knows how to deal with it. And I executive produced a documentary about ALS, and I was recently in Austin for South by Southwest, and there was a screening. And this lovely woman came up to me and said, her husband had died of ALS. And she said, I read your book. It was so helpful. And one line has stuck with me. And the line in the book was something like, I did everything I could to help keep Jay alive. I wish I had done a better job of helping him die. And I still think it is really hard to navigate how to deal with a terminal illness. I interviewed a death doula about this, because now there are people who help families and help patients deal with this kind of situation. But you're completely unequipped to handle this. And I think everyone needs a social worker, a therapist, somebody. Of course, this is unrealistic. There are not enough therapists to deal with all the problems people are having, but there needs to be some kind of, there can't be a blueprint because everyone's different, but some kind of guidance for people on how to talk about these things. Because I was in a state of denial. Jay and I never talked about what if. The closest we came, as I wrote in my book, is we had a house in Millbrook, New York, and I said, I don't know if I'll be able to come to this house if you're not around. And all he said was, well, I hope it'll be full of happy memories. And that's the closest we came to acknowledging that he may not survive. And he had stage 4 colon cancer, and the odds of him surviving that for any period of time back then in 1997 when he was diagnosed were so small. And yet we couldn't face the possibility. It was too painful. You know, and my nephew's an oncologist. My sister Emily died of pancreatic cancer, and her son Ray is an oncologist. And I would like to ask you the same question in addition to why so many young people are getting diagnosed with colon cancer. But I said to Ray, you know, you have to deal with so much sadness and tell people such terrible news. How do you handle that? And he said, sometimes I just sit. He said, I had a man, 38, with like 2 little kids. And I had to tell him and his wife that there were no more therapies. You know, he must have exhausted all the possibilities, even though there are many more now than there were when Jay was ill, but still not enough and still not very effective. They may extend life a bit.
That's right.
So he said, sometimes I just sit in the room and I cry with them.
Yeah, and I do the same. I mean, I think that there is a fine line between hope and honesty and transparency, but I actually think you can do all of those things. But I will say that I think one of the challenges is when it happens so fast. I mean, 9 months is a very short period of time. You're in the storm.
Yeah.
And you're really trying to figure out and unraveling, like you said, you're getting information, you're trying your best to try to figure out what we can do to move to the next play. And it's not like other times where you may have a couple of years to sort of think about it. But I do think that transparency and honesty of sort of saying, I don't know, you know, I can't play God to know exactly when something might happen as a cancer doc, but I can sort of say, what is important to you towards the end of life? You know, what might be something that you want folks to remember you by, et cetera. It's just very hard to do that when it's such a short period of
honestly,
time.
that like feels like a stake in my heart even to hear you say that, because that, you know, as you said, there's such a fine line between hope and being realistic. And, you know, for me, I think I was sort of Pollyanna during the whole ordeal because I didn't want the rest of Jay's life to be full of despair. I wanted him to have the hope that would kind of keep him going. And maybe he knew and let me pretend.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe he knew and pretended that he didn't for me. Who knows? But it's very complicated. And I feel like maybe people should talk about things like this before they get sick, you know?
Well,
I don't know.
That's the ideal. And I do think that we are trying to have more of those conversations. In fact, one of our guests here tonight brought to MSK something called Death Over Dinner, where you actually sit around a table and you say, what would be important to you before you pass? What do you want people to know about you? To have these conversations early on so that you can reflect on them whenever that time comes. Because I think, you know, all of us have no guarantees, right?
Right. And all of us are going to end up in the same place, you know?
Absolutely.
Like, you know, scattered around somewhere or in the ground or, anyway.
So fast forward. You recently had another Couric Effect into action. You decided to document your mammogram because you were 6 months behind, like many of us, during the COVID crisis. And you thought it would be a good reminder for women. Let's take a lesson.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Couric. Today, I'm going to tell you a very personal story.
Better than Spain. Okay.
It was June 20th, and because of the pandemic, I was 6 months overdue for a mammogram.
Okay, hold your breath. Okay, you can cover up.
My annual breast exam has been a two-step process.
Yep.
Are we going now?
We're going to go back to ultrasound.
I, like 45% of women over the age of 40, have dense breasts. So in addition to getting a mammogram, I also get a breast ultrasound.
You had your mammogram, and really all looked pretty stable on the mammogram. There was one area where the tissue looked a little bit more distorted than in the past. And when I got to that area on ultrasound, what I saw was a mass. And that mass had irregular margins. And I looked at you and I looked at the person who was imaging us, and I said, I think we really need to turn the camera off. I want to speak frankly. So can I stop for a second here?
How did that feel? I mean, was it a moment? It's certainly different diagnosis in terms of a different cancer, but boy, I can only imagine, like, how did you feel when that happened, and then particularly when the diagnosis was made?
You know, it was really weird. I think because I've had so much experience with cancer with Jay and then with my sister Emily. My mother-in-law, Carol, had ovarian cancer when Jay was diagnosed. I've had many friends with cancer. As you mentioned, my husband, John, had a carcinoid tumor a couple of months before we were married, and that was a nightmare. So I'd been through it.
Yeah.
And my mom had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
That's right. You
And my
write about
dad
that in
had
the
had a
book.
couple of different cancers. So I sort of had known every body
All
part
different
involving
parts.
cancer. And, I was really actually very calm about it. It was weird. I mean, I thought, okay. And she did a biopsy immediately and then called me, I think the next day, and said that she had found something, that it was cancerous. And I think she reassured me right away. And because Emily was diagnosed, her pancreatic cancer, she had it all over her liver. Jay was stage 4. She reassured me almost immediately that it had been detected early. And despite the fact that I was 6 months late, I was pretty religious about getting my mammogram. And I thought, well, I'm so, so lucky. That's what I thought almost right away, that I could get a lumpectomy and radiation. They would find out through my oncotype if I needed chemotherapy, but and if there was any lymph node involvement. And I felt really fortunate because I could afford to get a mammogram and a sonogram or an ultrasound. And, just fortunate that it was 2022 and that modern medicine was able to
That's right.
detect something like that so early. I just kept thinking, I'm so lucky and so many people aren't, honestly. I kept thinking about people, underserved patients who don't have access, who don't have insurance, who have not, don't necessarily have the knowledge, culturally maybe don't feel as comfortable with doctors and with screening, with good reason in some cases,
That's
given our
absolutely right.
history. And I kept thinking it's unfair to have an almost caste system of medical care in the United States. So I thought a lot about that. And I don't know. I just thought, God, I'm lucky. I can get this taken care of. And I'm pretty sure it's not going to kill
Okay.
me. It's not only treatable, they told me it's curable. So I felt very grateful, honestly.
That's great. And I think we are very grateful that you again shared that experience so that others would again go and get their mammograms and or ultrasounds when needed. Over the years, other colleagues have followed your lead and have used their voice to share their journeys with illnesses and cancers. And we know that that's obviously a personal choice for people to decide. But when the media covers these high-profile people, celebs, influencers, there's no question there's an uptick in that screening. Do you think the media has a role and a responsibility of using their voice?
I mean, I think it's a highly personal decision in terms of sharing something that has happened to you. I think some people have different comfort levels. So I don't think anyone has a personal responsibility to share their individual stories. But I do think the media writ large needs to educate the public and and do a really good job of arming them with life-saving knowledge. You know, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about my breast cancer journey, and actually that I wanted to talk about getting my mammogram, was I realized women were not educated about breast density. And that's something that I have known about, you know, because I think I go to one of the best doctors in New York. And I'm also, you know, I'm curious, so I learn about all these things. But I realized, and through my reporting after I was diagnosed, discovered that 45% of women 40 and over have what are considered dense breasts. And that makes it very difficult for an abnormality or a tumor to be discovered through mammography.
That's right.
And those women really need additional screening, like a breast ultrasound or an MRI. The problem is, if you have dense breasts, if you're one of that or part of that 45%, your insurance often doesn't pay for additional screening. So it's only women of means who are able to prevent breast cancer in those cases. So I am a lunatic talking about dense breasts.
Tell us what you've been doing, particularly the Find It Early Act.
So the FDA recently, I had nothing to do with this, so I can't claim any credit because they made the proposal in 2019, but because the nation had a lot of other health issues to deal with,
things going on.
They were delayed in implementing it, but they did call me. So I think maybe I lit a bit of a fire under them. And now the FDA has a new ruling that goes into effect in September of 2024 that says all clinicians and doctors and radiologists have to inform women that they have dense breasts. Now, 38 states already do, but the language, wildly varies among these states. And oftentimes it's like, hey, just so you know, Diane, your mammogram was fine, but you do have dense breasts. And people are like, oh, that's interesting.
That's like
what
not
am
English
I supposed
to
to
most people.
Yeah, what
That
am I
doesn't mean
supposed to do with that
anything. That's right.
information? Now, in very clear, concise language, doctors or the office or whatever it is, the clinic has to notify the woman and say, I don't know what the specific language is going to be, but you have dense breasts, and most cases you need additional screening, you need to talk to your doctor. And now the next step, so that's great. So
That's right.
Now the next step is something called the Find It Early Act, which I went down. John makes fun of me. He says, who do you think you are, Nancy Pelosi? Because I went down to Washington and I was at a press conference with Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro of Connecticut, who's been a real advocate for all kinds of health issues. And we're trying to get insurance coverage required for women for secondary screenings for women who have dense breasts because so many cases are missed. And if they're missed, they're not diagnosed early enough to have a favorable outcome like mine. So the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force is also looking at this because so many doctors take their lead and insurance companies from their recommendations. They are looking at this and hopefully they'll come up with recommendations that say, if you have dense breasts, you need to get follow-up screening. And in that case, we won't need the legislation. But if they don't, hopefully legislation will pass that will require insurance companies to pay for these additional screenings with no out-of-pocket expenses for the woman. I laughed the other day because I said if we spend as much time on women's health issues as we have Viagra, we probably wouldn't have these problems.
100%.
Yeah, what up with that, by the way?
Come on.
Women's health is so ignored and neglected. It's really a travesty.
Yeah. Speaking of legislation and public health, have traditional sources of information about public health like the CDC, the FDA, do you think they've lost credibility?
Sadly, I think because of COVID, and I'm sure you have many thoughts on this, because it was evolving in real time, there were often no simple or black and white answers to what was going on because science doesn't work that way. It's imperfect, right? And it comes in fits and starts, and sometimes things have to be adjusted. And I'm so proud of all the scientists who worked so hard
So
during the
nice.
pandemic, and the public health officials who had to communicate to people
Yeah.
what was going on when sometimes they themselves didn't know. So I think as a result of that, and a result of polarization and disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation, all kinds of disinformation now, that some people have lost faith in science. You and I were talking before we sat down for this podcast. This was happening prior to
Right.
the pandemic. There was a kind of a decline in in our faith and expertise for some weird reason. I mean, this probably would require a whole other podcast, but it's really, really upsetting. There was sort of this anti-intellectualism that was bubbling up that we saw in politics,
Right.
especially. And so I think that has bled into science, and
Yeah.
obviously politics and science were inextricably linked during the
That's
pandemic.
right.
So I do think they have to work hard to build up their credibility, but it's often difficult when there is so much disinformation out there, and people have created their own information ecosystems, and sometimes you can't
You just
penetrate
can't
them,
penetrate. Yeah.
and it's very, very frustrating. But I'm hoping the pendulum will shift the other way, and all we can do is try to give people information. I mean, you saw that with the vaccine
That's right.
happening, and of course now they're one of the biggest areas of promise for cancer prevention are
Is on vaccines. That's
vaccines.
exactly
And
right.
so
And
you
patients are
hope
terrified. That's
that
right.
mistrust won't prevent people from getting potentially, and obviously they'll be proven through clinical trials, but life-saving vaccines that will prevent them
Yeah.
from
With
ever
very,
getting cancer in
that's
the
right.
first
And very
place.
similar technology to what was
Right.
done. Yeah. I
And
mean,
mRNA,
yeah, that's exactly
that
right.
technology, I think, is going to power a lot of cancer vaccines,
That's
which
right.
is so exciting. I'm really excited about what's on the horizon for cancer diagnosis, treatment, and prevention.
Yeah, as am I. And in fact, one of the reasons why I started this podcast was just that, particularly in the cancer space, there's so much disinformation. I mean, you go on Google and there's just crazy stuff
Well,
on
Google
how you
shouldn't
should
let that
treat.
happen.
They shouldn't. And yet it's like the number one on YouTubes and other things. And so we're
Well,
really
yeah.
trying to drive, an understanding based on the evidence, just like
Yeah.
you're doing in
Yeah.
your own media company, right?
It's
I mean,
really
you have-
difficult because in the U.S. we have this whole free speech thing, which is obviously important,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
something that I've built my career on. On the other hand, so it's very hard to eliminate or to even reduce the amount of disinformation. But I think you have to drown out some of those
That's right.
voices with the voices of people who are reputable and and know what they're talking about. And also, I think it's a real indictment of our education system that people have so much mistrust in people who have a lot of expertise. But I also think it's important for these experts, people who do have the background and the experience and the knowledge to have humility
That's right.
too, especially in a situation like the pandemic, and to admit this. And I think Tony Fauci did.
Absolutely. I
This
think
is
he did.
evolving. This
Yeah.
is happening. We can't always be right. I mean, there's still a lot of
Yeah.
confusion about the origin
Yeah. And I
of
think in our
COVID
world,
and
we
the
know
Wuhan
that.
lab,
Right.
and now the Wall
Right.
Street Journal is, so I think it's really important to be transparent and honest with the American people about what we know and what we don't know.
100%. And where do you get your information about your own, just public health in general? Do you have a trusted source that you use?
I mean,
Surrounded by a
I
lot
mean,
of the
honestly,
experts.
everywhere. Well, first of
Yeah.
all, I call my friends who are doctors,
As you should.
who I trust. I'm very lucky. One of the silver linings, I guess, about my life experience is I've gotten to know a lot of doctors, and I respect them so much and appreciate them so much. So if I really have a question, I go to that. But I've gotten pretty good at reading medical journals. It's not what I read before I go to bed or anything, but I think because I had to absorb so much complex information when Jay was sick, and then I had to kind of synthesize it, and not only for the public when I did
Right.
my colon cancer coverage, but also for the for me,
Right.
so I could understand what was going on. So I go to a lot of different sources for information, but I always look at the source. I always say, "Oh, that's from this," and then I'll do a little more digging and say, "Oh, they're this group. They have a political agenda," and then I discount what they say. So I think you have to be a very, educated consumer, as
Just
Cy
like how we
Sims
read
used
our
to
news,
say.
right?
And that takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of skills. You have to really be a critical thinker and evaluate things. But I think in the current media landscape, it's absolutely essential. So I pretty much know and recognize through my years of reporting trusted sources like Lancet or
right.
trusted, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal and other medical places that I've heard of. There are a lot of sketchy medical organizations
Yes,
that
there are.
look like they're really legit
Yeah.
and have, the seal and all that stuff, but you dig a little deeper and you realize, oh, this
Under the
is
lid.
really
Crazy town.
crazy town. Exactly.
right.
Exactly.
Terrific. It's okay. We're going to go to some questions
Sure.
that our audience
Oh,
actually
yeah.
asked for us. What was the best piece of advice you received during your treatment and recovery?
I'm trying to think. Don't go swimming.
Okay.
After I had my lumpectomy, and it was in the summer, and
Oh,
it was
boy.
a massive
Yeah.
bummer. Then I had to wear one at like a tube top,
Yeah.
and that was really miserable. But I followed doctor's orders, and I
Okay.
didn't. But I don't know. I don't think anyone gave me advice because I was so kind of comfortable with the whole
Yeah.
situation. And so, yeah, I just kind of forged ahead.
with it.
And I'm trying to think. I mean, my doctor said take the aromatase inhibitors. Those are the
Yeah.
pills because I had hormone receptor positive breast
That's right.
cancer, which they say is the best breast cancer, which
There's
is
no
great.
good.
Yeah.
There's
No,
no
it's
good
okay. I mean,
cancer.
listen,
Yeah.
I don't know. I sort of think it's not good,
Yeah.
but it is preferable.
Yes.
And,
That is true.
I just kind of got through it
Yeah.
pretty easily. And I think for me, what's cathartic and healing and helpful is to share, maybe overshare at times, but to kind of use my own personal experience. I don't know. Obviously, I think I get a lot of satisfaction and gratification from talking about my situation, knowing it's going to help someone else. So I think that's kind of my go-to
Beautiful.
position.
Beautiful. What has been the most gratifying for you in terms of using your platform to further cancer research? We didn't get a chance to talk up to Stand Up for Cancer, which has been absolutely tremendous in terms of what you've done to help move forward the cancer research platform.
Yeah. Well, these are the scientists, and I started it with I always say 9 other crazy
love
type
that.
A women. Kathleen Lobb, my good friend from the University of Virginia, we were RAs together. She's one of the founders, and she's in the audience tonight. I think the purpose of Stand Up to Cancer was collaboration instead of competition.
Yeah.
Because when I was going through everything with Jay, it was very difficult because I felt like people were proprietary. I was calling everywhere trying to get information. And I think we all realized that instead of competition, if there was more collaboration and scientists shared their knowledge and their research and their tissue samples, that we would be able to move science forward faster.
100%.
And I think, Stand Up to Cancer has contributed to 9 FDA-approved drugs. They were involved in Dr. Diaz's
The rectal study. That's
cancer
right.
study at Memorial
Which
Sloan
was a
Kettering.
complete response with
Yeah.
immunotherapy.
Right. I think cancer research is so critically important. And what I think is so fascinating is, I think there used to be very organ-specific cancer research.
right.
And now I think scientists are understanding much better how cancer in general behaves.
Right. And the
that's-
drivers.
Yes,
of that
and certain
cancer.
therapies can actually be incredibly effective for a whole host of cancers. And then obviously immunotherapy, which people laughed at,
I know.
20 years
I
ago,
know.
which is building up your own immune system to quash the cancer
That's
cells. I think most of our research dollars are now going to immunotherapeutic approaches. So I think I geek out on all this
I love
stuff.
it.
Like, just these scientists are so brilliant, and they're so, I think, underappreciated in our society. They're working day in and day out. They are crazy smart.
Crazy.
And I just think they deserve a lot of attention and funding, because I remember reading that only 1 in 10 promising research proposals was approved and funded by the NCI. And I thought, that means like 90%
I
of good
know.
ideas are left on the cutting room floor. How could that be? And that's why I think it's been wonderful to see organizations like Stand Up to Cancer and a host of really incredible organizations that are raising money for cancer research and keeping these scientists going. I think it's so important and so exciting. And now we're at this super cool time where technology and basic biology and data
Yeah.
and, you know, and
Analytics and AI,
epigenetics
yeah.
and AI is going to be
And
really
that's palpable. Like the technology is there.
What do you think specifically AI is going to be able to do when it comes to cancer diagnosis and treatment?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that the idea of big data, like you said, you know, an example of that was what you said before, where we used to take breast cancer, which is hundreds of different diseases, and just because it started in the breast, lump them all together for all these trials. Now, if we have the ability to finally take all that different data from different institutions and different things, we can start to sort of drive. Now, a lot of people are, you know, doing genetics is standard of care.
Right.
So that was never the case. So we can start to define these different diseases genetically, put them all into these databases, and then they even have the ability to start thinking technologically about, okay, what might drive that through these programs? And you could even start to like test different ideas and different things using those different types of technologies and methods. So I do think that the ability to sort of take all that big data together and then have that drive the clinical trials that we're going to conduct is going to be really exciting.
And AI is going to help to power
I think
that.
the big data is exactly.
Yeah.
The big data and the ability to program to be able to utilize that data in an easier way is going to get us to where we need to be.
Can I ask you one more
Yeah,
question?
please.
So I mentioned earlier that a lot more young people are being diagnosed with colorectal cancer. And I have people come up to me all the time, also breast cancer, but let's just focus on colorectal for the moment. Why do you think that's happening? Because it seems that doctors are slightly flummoxed about this
Yeah.
and don't really understand it. I've heard, you know, the old obesity argument just doesn't really seem to hold
That's
water.
absolutely not holding
I've
water
heard,
with the younger patients.
I've heard that the overprescription of antibiotics might be affecting the
the microbiome.
microbiome. I've also heard that it might be environmental. Maybe it's something to do with plastics and microplastics. Anyway, this is such a cheery conversation for our poor audience. They're like, okay, I'm going to go have a drink. But what do you think it is?
So I think that.
And why don't we know, by the
Yes.
way?
Well, you know, I think that the piece on what we call the epidemiology of understanding how the cancer develops is not a very
Sexy field?
sexy or even funded field.
Oh.
And I think because to cast the net, it's so wide to understand. And the reason for that is multifold. But the biggest challenge is, you know, cancer over time, which I'm sure you've learned, it starts from the damage in the cell called the gene, which is a mutation. So the gene gets damaged with this mutation, but what can happen is actually you have that one damaged mutation. It may happen when we're 12 years old.
Right.
But then over time, maybe another mutation develops a couple years later, and then another mutation develops. And so I use the analogy of like the bingo card.
Yeah.
It actually takes a couple of mutations before bingo. Now the cell turns on instead of turns off, and the cancer develops. So what damages all those different mutations or those genes over time is different for everyone. Sometimes it's just our own immune system and our own, like we just mess up.
and it, didn't correct itself. Sometimes it's in the environment. Sometimes, and I do think for colon cancer, there's probably something about what we call that microbiome, which is all the bacteria in the colon that may have changed the flora over time, why it changed and what that really means. We're not there yet.
Do you think it's some dietary difference that's making it change, something like chemicals in processed foods, or I just don't understand?
Yeah, I think I will say, I'm not sure, but most of my patients, some of whom are actually with us tonight, they are the picture perfect health, and they got colon cancer. They didn't eat crap, excuse my friend. They did everything right, and these cancers still develop. So I think there's more to learn.
Right.
But,
yes. I feel like
nothing they
diet
did or
is
didn't
always
do.
kind of the diet and exercise, obesity, blah, 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 is always kind of the fallback position. And I
Right.
think about Jay, he, for the most part, had a healthy diet. He drank moderately. He had never smoked
Yeah.
a cigarette in his life. He never smoked a joint, which I could never understand, but he didn't.
Well,
And so he played lacrosse and football in college.
Right.
I mean, he was a healthy guy.
Right.
And and I think maybe his grandmother had breast cancer, his mom had ovarian. I think
There
that
may have
there
been a
is
gene
some
one of the
connection
genes
with
along that
these
cascade may have been.
adenocarcinomas,
Mhm,
right? That
that's
they
right.
may be
That's right.
connected.
Yeah.
But I feel like there's still so much to learn. And that's why, getting back to research, it's so important to
right.
fund these scientists.
Yeah. Well, that's what we're going to do. Katie Couric, thank you so much for being part of that team and for joining me today.
You're welcome. Thanks, Diane.
Thank
Thanks for letting
you.
me ask a couple of questions, too.
Thank you.
If you want more news from Katie, go to katiecouric.com and sign up for a wake-up call for her daily newsletter. Thank you for listening to Cancer Straight Talk from Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. For more information or to send us your questions, please visit us at mskcc.org/podcast. Help others find this helpful resource by rating and reviewing this podcast at Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Any products mentioned on this show are not official endorsements by Memorial Sloan Kettering. These episodes are for you, but are not intended to be a medical substitute. Please remember to consult your doctor with any medical conditions you may have. I'm Dr. Diane Reidy-Lagunes. Onward and upward.